Hour.
On the podcast, Earth Rewilding Project called to a halt by alien rangers as Ecosphere returned to the bees and mole rats, previously in charge of matters. West of the sun and east of the moon is south of the border in Tir Na Nog, plus we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of David Weber's Uncompromising Honor, all right now. Welcome to the Baen Free Radio Hour podcast. It's an honor to have you along. I'm Baen Senior Editor Tony Daniel. This time we talk to Clay Reynolds, author of Western fiction, both historical and modern. Reynolds is a Spur Award winner and Pulitzer Prize nominee whose deeply researched novels set in Texas historical times, some consider on par with the likes of Larry McMurtry, and whose highly regarded contemporary novels are bittersweet portraits of life in a sometimes hard and unforgiving land, a land in which I've lived for several years, and I think Clay knows whereof he speaks. All of Clay Reynolds' novels are available in ebook form from Baen Ebooks, by the way, and have been for several years. So we want to talk with him about this most excellent body of work and make you aware of it. And we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of David Weber's Honor Harrington series masterpiece, Uncompromising Honor. Now here's the news. We have an April ebook sale, and it's a doozy of bargainiferous proportions. King Jerry's Spaceship, April Jerry Pournelle ebook sale. To celebrate the new Starborn and Godsons mass market edition, we're dropping prices on all Jerry Pournelle ebooks. $2 off the ebook for Starborn and Godsons by Jerry Pournelle, Larry Niven, and Stephen Barnes, and $1 off ebooks such as The Legacy of Heorot by Jerry Pournelle, Larry Niven, and Steve Barnes, and Beowulf's Children. Those are the two sequels to Starborn and Godsons. The Best of Jerry Pournelle, edited by John F. Carr, is also $1 off. Mamelukes, Janissaries, Lord of Janissaries, Footfall, and oh so many more. Anything the late, great Jerry Pournelle had a hand in, we are discounting at the Baen website and across all of our ebook retailers. So check it out. Sale ends April 30th. Hey, I want to welcome Clay Reynolds to the podcast. Hey, Clay.
Hey, Tony. Good to see you again.
Nice to see you. Let me talk a little bit about you. Clay Reynolds is a legend of contemporary and historical Western fiction. He's the winner of the Western Writers of America Spur Award. You did win a Spur. I know you've been nominated many times, right?
I won two, actually. I won two at once, 2 in 1 year. So, I
That's
won
accurate.
Creative nonfiction and for fiction for a short story.
Uh,
Never won it for a novel, unfortunately. Franklin's Crossing was nominated and was a runner-up, but it didn't win it that year. Elmer Kelton got it, as usual, in that era.
uh-huh.
I think he won about 10 in a row.
Well, let me go over all right. So he's the creator of Tales of Grit, Daring Mystery, and Determination, bred by living in an unforgiving, starkly beautiful landscape, which is pretty much Texas, and Sandline County, which is his invented Yoknapatawpha of, we'll talk about that. Plus other places, of course, Dallas, New York, you have all kind of settings, of course. Being a writer of many things. Clay's first novel was The Vigil, which won an Opie in 1986. His third novel, Franklin's Crossing, was one of the Pulitzer Prize. I know it was a semifinalist, something like that, but it was up there.
It was nominated, yeah.
Yeah, and received a bunch of other awards and honors. He's the winner of the Spur Awards, as we said. Articles have appeared in many national magazines. He's now retired professor of arts and humanities and creative writing after 20 years service on the faculty of the University of Texas at Dallas, where we met, where he served as professor of humanities and creative writing, and also served as the director of creative writing and some other administrative functions there. His published novels are The Vigil, It's Agatai, right?
Agatai, that's correct.
Agatai, Franklin's Crossing, Players, Monuments, Threading the Needle, The Tent Maker, Ars Poetica, Vox Populi, and a collection of short fiction, Sandhill County Lines. He's also written a bunch of nonfiction scholarly work and a very interesting collection and sort of critical celebration of the great dime novelist Ned Buntline. Clay lives on an acre of sunbaked ground in Lowry Crossing, Texas, which I have seen. I think I visited once with some of the writing students. With his wife, Judy, and various animals. His kids are all grown. One's a veterinarian and the other is a structural engineer. So they turned out pretty good. But what I want to talk about today is just sort of your body of work, which we have available at Baen.com and across all of our distribution outlets, including Amazon, that in ebook form. For instance, we have this is the Baen edition of Franklin's Crossing, which is available as an ebook on Amazon and B&N and wherever we distribute. Maybe we could start by tell us. I like your origin story. You want to start with that, like the fact that you didn't really think you were going to be a writer.
Right. Yeah, I took a single creative writing class, and as an undergraduate, I took it from Gene McKinney, who's a playwright of some note dating back to the 40s, and was on the staff of the. I started at Trinity University in San Antonio, which was a sort of a private liberal arts school. I was a drama major. McKinney was on the drama faculty, and he's a great guy. I mean, a sweetheart of a guy, but the course wasn't worth much. I mostly took it because I was interested in a girl that was in it. And I don't think we wrote anything. I don't think we wrote a single word of creative material. He mostly told stories about his time on Broadway. And my main recollection of it is that the girl never went out with me, and that somewhere or another, his cuff pants never quite met the top of his socks. And we sat in a circle, and it was sort of an evident thing that kind of distracted from everything else. And he smoked this huge briar pipe that filled the entire room with the most obnoxious smoke. And I'm a smoker, so that says a lot. But I was denied access to the creative writing classes after I transferred to UT. I submitted work, and it was all rejected. And I was told I didn't qualify to be a creative writer there. So I wound up with a history degree from there, and then went on into graduate school. And there's a whole story about why that happened the way it did, but I won't go into that now. But I wound up taking a master's, went back to Trinity, ironically and unavoidably, and did a master's degree there in English. Then I went to the University of Tulsa for my doctoral degree in modern letters, which is kind of a broader literary degree that encompasses a lot of humanities, history and philosophy in particular, and literary theory and criticism. And when I finished at Tulsa, and as well as at Trinity during my master's, there were a lot of creative writing people there, and I had kind of a healthy contempt for them. I thought they were sort of dilettantes, and they talked a lot about writing, but they didn't write very much. And they were also sort of a world unto themselves. And I saw it as a kind of a way of getting out of doing the hard work of scholarship, in a sense. And I was kind of elitist about that. My first teaching job was at a small Texas university down in the southeast Texas, Lamar University in Beaumont. And Lamar had a practice of bringing in and rotating through 3-year appointments of people who largely had master's degrees and taught for 3 years in lower division classes, and then were let go. So that way they didn't have to tenure them, but they got the work out of them for slave labor wages. And 1 year they hired, on a 3-year stint, about 5 people who had MFAs, Masters of Fine Arts in Creative Writing, from various places. And these people formed a kind of cabal, a clique, as it were. And I was on the periphery of that because I had made friends with a couple of them, and they had Friday afternoon drinking sessions and whatnot. And once again, I discovered they talked a lot about writing, but they didn't write very much. They mostly were interested in exchanging stories about publishers they knew and agents they had met and writing conferences they'd gone to and one thing and another, but they didn't really write very much. And so at the time, I had small children. My wife worked nights and I had full charge of them from 4 o'clock on, and couldn't get to the library to do research I had needed to do to publish scholarship. I was actively writing a lot of scholarship in those days, a good many critical articles on books. I was doing and I did in fact I had a drama book that I'd done on American drama that had been accepted for publication, and I was revising that and doing all sorts of work, but I couldn't get to the library and take care of children at home in diapers at home. So I was at home and I had to stay awake. And I know that Tony has young children, or had young children, and so you know what I'm talking about. You can't take a nap when you're the only responsible adult in the household, and they might awaken and need something. And if I watched television, which was only 3 channel TV, or tried to read or grade papers or the stuff I needed or wanted to do, I couldn't do it because I'd fall asleep. But I could sit at a typewriter and stay awake. And I sort of got in the habit of playing around with some fiction because I didn't have to go to the library. I could make up what I didn't know. And I wrote a couple of pieces, and I finished actually 2 manuscripts and sent them off. One of the people in the clique had become a very good friend, and he gave me the names of two people. One was an editor at St. Martin's Press, Dick Merrick, and the other was an agent in New York, Ethan Ellenberg. I didn't know any of these people. He had met them at a writers conference he had gone to somewhere, and gave me these 2 shop-worn cards that were creased and folded and greasy. And I just was in the habit of submitting scholarly work on a weekly basis. I was sending out something all the time. And so I went ahead and just packaged up packaged up these 2 books, sent one to Merrick and one to Ellenberg. And that was in December of 84, I guess, or in November of 84. And then in the end of December of 84, very end of December during the holidays, I had a call from Dick Merrick, who said he wanted to publish Agatite. I liked it. He thought it was quirky, a different kind of novel, something a little offbeat, and he thought it would really do well. And he offered me an advance, a small one, very small one, and I sort of took it in stride, and I said, okay, thank you very much. And I was very excited and hung up and stood there in my empty house because my wife was away with the children that afternoon. It was very cold outside. And I thought for a second, this is just the kind of joke that a lot of people would play on me. Just sounds a little bit weird. And knowing this guy that gave me the cards, I thought it would be just like him to do something like this. So I picked up the card, found out the card, and called St. Martin's in New York and got the PBX operator, asked for Dick Merrick. She put me through to him. And I said, this is a strange question, but did you just call me? He started laughing, and he said, yeah. And we went over the same material again. And he said, you don't have an agent, do you? And I said, no, I don't. And he said, well, you need one. And I said, okay, do you recommend somebody? He said, I can't do that. That's unethical. And I said, well, I'd sent this other book to Ethan Ellenberg. He said, oh, I know him. And he's a great guy. I can say that without violating anything. So I immediately hung up and called Ellenberg, got his answering machine, and said, I submitted a book to you about a month ago. I haven't heard from you, but I just placed a book with St. Martin's Press. Would you be interested in representing me? And he called me back in 10 minutes, and we began a relationship we still have after all these years. And I don't know that I've ever made any money for him to speak of. He's been very diligent and very loyal, and a very good sounding board for the kind of thing I wanted to do, and very honest with me all the time. I appreciated that. So it's not always what I wanted to hear. He doesn't do that. But he was a very upright guy.
I've dealt with. He's one of our other authors' agents.
Yeah, he's a good guy. I mean, he's strong, and I think he's very demanding, but and he's very businesslike and very business minded. And even though I know I've met his family and so forth when I visited New York. I don't feel as if we're friends so much as close business associates, but I trust him. And he's never given me bad advice, except once in a while. His advice has been, I think, overruled by an editor, and to my advantage and the advantage of the books in question. I wrote a crime novel that Ethan wanted me to cut several sections out of, and I did. And then the editor, this was at Carroll and Graf Publishers in New York. The editor came back and said, "Well, there's some holes here. There's gaps here that need to be filled. Can you fill these in? And get, And so I said, yeah, I think I can do that, because I already had this stuff lying on my desk. All I had to do was just mail it to him. And so he just stuck them in the appropriate places. So sometimes instincts aren't always correct. But that was the way I got started. And suddenly I had 3 books come out in 1 year. The drama book and the 2 novels all came out the same year. But then I had a checkered and a lengthy and boring experience with a series of editors after that, and publishers after that. So
did that original St. Martin's editor, what was his name again? Dick Merrick?
Richard Merrick, yeah.
Merrick.
Yeah, he went on to become president and publisher at E.P. Dutton.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, and then he was fired from that when they closed, when Viking Penguin, which is a parent company of Dutton, closed them in 1989. And that's what it was a week after Franklin's Crossing hit his desk. Completed manuscript hit his desk.
I believe he's got it imprint, or did. So what is was that, with those 2 novels, The Vigil and Agatite, or was it?
Yeah, they were published out of order. He decided to publish The Vigil first, and then 6 months later brought out Agatite, thinking that it would attract a wider audience. He felt The Vigil was too focused on a particular kind of audience, because it was such an intense story and a small story. It's much smaller. Agatite was a bigger canvas. So
let's talk about The Vigil, which is all right. So you grew up in where? Quina, Texas?
Quanah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Which is up there between Wichita Falls and God
Amarillo,
knows where, Dalhart or something.
Amarillo. Yeah, about halfway between Wichita Falls and Amarillo.
And this is set in and The Vigil is set in such a West Texas town.
Right.
And it's about a woman who is sitting on a bench, and that's what it's about.
Pretty much, yeah. The genesis of that story is that I read this article when I was in graduate school in Tulsa. The Tulsa paper, and I think it was The World, which was the evening edition, might have been the morning edition, I don't remember, but there were 2 papers a day in those days, published a feature story in a Sunday edition about a woman who had been traveling from somewhere in the South, Atlanta or somewhere, en route to Oregon in the 1930s, 1936, I think it was, and who had, by train, and with her daughter, who was 7 or 8 years old. And her daughter asked for some money to go buy a chewing gum or candy. And at those days, there were newsstands inside the depots. It stopped in what I recall to be Guthrie, Oklahoma, which is a ranch community out north and a little bit east of Oklahoma City. And she watched the girl get off the train through the window of the train to the Pullman car she was on, go into the depot, and she didn't come out. And she waited and waited and waited, and the train was going. The conductor was signaling for it to move on. So she jumped off the train and went into the depot looking for it, and never found it. And they mobilized the whole community. The sheriff's posse was formed. They went out and searched. They looked everywhere. They never found her. Never found any evidence of her at all. And the woman waited there for, I think, 2 months. She stayed in Guthrie, hoping for some word of her daughter. This was 1936, the height of the depth of the Depression. And Guthrie probably had a population of maybe 3,000 or 4,000 people. It wasn't a very big place. And but it was surrounded by ranch land, open prairie. They looked for her, never found her. And then finally she got on the train and went on. She had other children, other obligations. And this news article is about her return to Guthrie. After all those years, no, 1976, I guess it was. So it's 40 years later. She came back. They had photographs of the little girl, photographs of the mother at the time, of the train station at the time, that sort of thing, published with this huge feature article they wrote. And it bothered me. I didn't have children at the time. We were years from children at the time. But it bothered me that a mother could just get on the train and go on. And that was the question that I sort of carried around for almost 10 years, was how does somebody just get on a train and go on with life? How do you do that? What sort of mindset do you have about that? So I started it as a short story, just about the mother contemplating all this from the bench of the court of a small town where this had happened. And I made a lot of changes. I moved it to Texas. I gave her a car instead of a train. It was a car broken down. I made it so she was stuck there to create a crucible effect, which is something that fiction requires. And I sort of set it up so that she had become something of a pariah in the town, because it reminded the town of its collective guilt in not preventing this from happening. And I wrote the story in 3 days, that much of it in 3 days. I have to say it ran about 120 pages, manuscript pages. And it was too long for a story. I didn't know what to do with it. So I showed it to a friend of mine who was an aspiring writer, but not part of that creative writing clique. And he said, the real story here is in the sheriff, who is mentioned, but not a character, not really developed. He said, this is where your story is. And he says, you're missing that. So I went back and wrote interchapters. So every other chapter, one is for the woman, the other's for the sheriff. And what it developed into, without my really trying to make it so, was a love story. But not really a romantic love story, but a sort of love story of mutual dependence and based on loss and grief, as much as on aspiration and hope. And I think that that's kind of what it turned out to be. And it was not a mystery. I didn't want it to be. A lot of people got upset with me. I got a lot of letters and comments from readers about the fact that it's not that the mystery isn't solved, the MacGuffin isn't really ever revealed. And I thought, well, that wasn't the point. The point was not on what happened to the little girl, either in the real story or in my story. I made the daughter 18 in my story, not a child, so she's older and really an adult. But about the impact of this on the parent, which I thought was far more evocative of emotional identity for a reader, rather than the some sort of shocking mystery that was revealed at the end. Because I wasn't trying to write a crime novel. I was trying to write a novel about human reactions. So that's kind of where that came from. And it's not the only time. Agatite also begins with a true incident that sort of kicked off the idea for the story, and that
Agatite
followed
is
it.
in the same setting as
It's in the same town. Yeah, I created this town, called it Agatite, and Agatite is actually the name of a Texas ghost town, which was a mill town, and it's in Hardeman County where I grew up. My grandfather used to take me out to the site of it. There's nothing left except some foundations and wellheads and that sort of thing, where people had lived there around I would say the first 20 years of the 20th century. And then it had died. It was a termination of a railroad, a 1.5-mile railroad, the shortest incorporated railroad in the world. It was built as, and it was a gyp mill, a gypsum mine set adjacent to it. And so they would mine the gypsum ore and they would transport it 1.5 miles down to the mill in Acme, which is where my father was from and born and reared up in, was Acme, Texas, which is in the same county and 5 miles from the county seat, Quanah, where I grew up. And so Agatite struck me as a good name for a town. It had a certain flinty edge to it. I'm not sure what it meant. I've had some interesting queries about that since and suggestions. There's a street in Chicago, Illinois, Agatite Street. And a reporter from the Chicago Sun-Times sent me a photograph of the street sign and asked me if I knew where it came from. And I pieced together that the gypsum plant there was owned by the parent company of it. It went to, this was turn of the century time, Burlington Northern Railroad, which was a huge corporation. And they actually owned the mill, the company did. Burlington Northern also owned the Wabash Plaster and Whitewash Company, which was in Chicago and was adjacent to Agatite Street. So there may be a connection there that I never could follow any. That was a dead end.
Certainly sounds geologic and
yeah, it sounds like something
dusty and West Texasy.
Yeah, and it's why gypsum. You've probably never been around a gyp mine, but it's my grandparents' home, which was across the street from the mill, was often in the summertime covered in white. If you took a photograph of it, you would think it was snow because it's gyp powder, it's gypsum. Yeah. It infects the water and everything else.
So, in Agatite, you got there's some crime going on because it's about what's his name, Frank Breedlove or
Roy Breedlove. Yeah, and I have
and he just sort of is a hapless fellow, but he's also a stone cold killer. But.
Yeah, it's a generational thing. He is a stone killer, but I don't know if that's true. He's an accidental killer. He doesn't mean to be a killer. He's never meant any harm to anyone, which is part of his problem. But he certainly does a lot of harm to people. He is a hapless fellow. He is one of these guys. His father was a drunk, and he knocks up his girlfriend, and so leaves town, and rather than leaves her at the altar pregnant, and runs off and can't seem to face life. He's always running from something. And I think that's the Breedlove that I wanted to create. My inspiration for him came from an odd source. I don't know if you've read or recently or remember the preface section to John Dos Passos' trilogy USA. The first book is The 42nd Parallel, and there's a very brief, like a page and a half, little preface called Vague.
I love that trilogy, but I don't remember the preface.
Oh, the preface is short. You might read over it. He doesn't figure in as a character anywhere. It's called Vag, V-A-G, and Vat for Vagabond. And it's about a guy hitchhiking across country and looking up at the sky and seeing an airliner going across period 1920 20s version of an airliner going across, and thinking of people going places, and him down on this highway with his thumb out, hitchhiking across country. And it's the period he does. It's very inspecific but it's very poetic, which is and probably overwritten because Dos Passos was a terrible overwriter. But
he developed.
Kind of struck me.
He was a writer of vignettes that he strung together. But
that's pretty much, yeah. And the structure of
I think he's great.
But
anyway,
yeah. Well, that's kind of the way Agatite is structured, along that same kind of various characters. I've got, I think, 16 characters in Agatite, that 16 points of view, all about one incident, which is based on a news article that my father sent me from my hometown. There's another little community in my county named Goodlet. There's a barbershop, general store, blacksmith shop, not much else there, farming community. And one afternoon, a young Hispanic boy came into the barbershop wanting a haircut, and the barbers there, being old rednecks, racists, I'm sure, rednecks, refused his service, and he asked if he could at least use the toilet, and they had an indoor toilet, but they told him no, I didn't have one, and had to go out back to the outside john, which they had an old outhouse sitting out behind the barber shop. So the kid goes around there, opens it up, and finds a woman's body hanging in it. And it's August, and it's 110 degrees, and the body had been hanging there a long, long time. And it turned out to be a woman who had been missing for some time, subject of a missing persons inquiry already, but she had disappeared, and it turned out it was suicide. She had hanged herself in this outhouse, and I don't know any more details about it than that. But my father thought it was interesting enough to send me a clipping from the hometown newspaper about it, and I thought, again, it's indirect. It wasn't the circumstances of the woman's death that intrigued me. It was the impact of discovering it. You know, what would this be like to open that door and see this? And I didn't want to do it from a child's point of view. So I created a sheriff who would be the one to open that door. And I made him a tough guy. I mean, he's a Korean War veteran, hero, really. A man of substantial physical and psychological strength, and suddenly he's confronted with this, what effectively is a mummified corpse. And I made it as horrific as possible. I'm not giving anything away here, but I made it as horrific as possible because I wanted it to be a sustaining image. And then I sort of extrapolated from that to create these multiple stories that all sort of come together in one kind of apocalyptic moment at the end of this novel, when it sort of is in a way a kind of a apocalyptic novel, because it has to do with human misbehavior contributing to an ultimate tragedy. And I think that that's kind of what it happens. Now, I'm looking at this in retrospect. I wasn't thinking like that when I was writing it. I was simply trying to tell a story. I don't think in terms of theme or message, or, what's the saying? If you want to send a message, call Western Union. Doesn't make sense to a younger generation who have no idea what that means. But but I guess if you want to send a message, use a text message, use your text somebody on the phone. But I'm not trying to send a message, but it was sort of an analysis. One friend of mine suggested it was
a portrait of the community.
Yeah, my revenge on the community. Too, which I guess I did probably settle some scores there in a metaphoric sense, but they were mostly in my head, so nobody was aware of that. I didn't go back and live there ever. Once I left when I was 17, I never returned, except to see my parents, visit my parents. I was never there for more. I think one time I spent 2 weeks there when I went dead broke in Houston after driving a 7-Up truck and trying to work in a steel foundry. But I had to spend 2 weeks with a job to get enough money to go back to college on. But other than that, I was never there for more than 2 or 3 days at a time, and hid out at my parents' house and didn't care to see anybody. So it was sort of in a way, you can't go home again kind of book.
Yeah.
But
well, those towns out there, I mean, I've seen towns that got down on their luck, but that particular stretch, those towns died.
Well, they were all railroad towns, and the railroad died. And that's what
I used to go through there all the time on the way from Dallas to Colorado and other places I was going.
Yeah. You may have noticed they're all 30 miles apart, 29 to 39. And the reason for that is that in the 19th century, a steam locomotive could only go about 30 miles without water. And so there would have to be a water stop every 30 miles. And that was why the towns are built the distance they are from each other. And they were all railroad towns. All the way up Highway 287 out of Fort Worth, 1 30-mile interval after another, all the way to Colorado.
So there's a particular kind of tarantula crawling, desperate times that stayed there. Into the present. Although I've seen some of them are surviving a little bit. But all right. So, but your next book, you went back in the past, and did
I did.
and in some ways, I mean, I don't want to, you probably heard this way too much, but this is a Larry McMurtry kind of pathway too.
Well, it was sort of, yeah, billed that way. I should say that the cover you guys have for it, the dust jacket you put up there, as far as the period of the one that Viking put on it when they finally published it as a Dutton imprint, but because they were clearly trying to imitate.
They used the exact same typeface
Yeah,
as Lonesome Dove.
Lonesome Dove.
Yeah.
I actually finished the book. That is, I started the book before Lonesome Dove was published, and I finished it before I read Lonesome Dove, and so there was never any direct connection there. I knew Larry. I've known Larry. I knew he's now deceased, of course, last month or so. But I knew him fairly well, and he and I talked a good deal, but never about writing. We talked about books mostly, and
Well, he was the famous book collector.
Oh, he was, yeah, and very, very well read, and a really nice guy. Very shy guy, but a very nice guy. And he and I got along.
When I was teaching at UTD, I used to give my kids extra points if they would go out to his bookstore, and, prove that they had visited. He bought his entire hometown and made it into a giant bookstore.
That's correct. Yeah. Well, he had rare bookshops in Tucson, Houston, and Georgetown, and near Washington, D.C. And I think at one time one in New York as well, and a branch in London. So he had a lot of books. And he had 3 full multi-story buildings full of books.
And these were like first edition. They were beautiful books.
Yeah, some of them were very rare books. And he knew books. He wrote a book called Cadillac Jack, which is about a book collector. It's a very interesting book. It's not a very good novel, but it's an interesting book. But in any case, no, I wasn't really thinking about that. And I wasn't trying to write a Western. I was trying to write an historical novel. And there's a difference, because I was more interested in historical accuracy than I was in trying to write a formula plot with the usual expected elements of that sort.
Franklin's Crossing, in a way, I think of it a little bit like the Canterbury Tales with Indians attacking, and it's different people's stories.
Well, it is. It's structured similarly to Agatai. I have several different people. I had to cut 3 characters out of it before publication for length reasons, and the history of the publication of that novel is a book in itself, and a cautionary tale to writers. But I came in at 1,700 manuscript pages, and it was published at, I think, 750 manuscript pages. So and then cut after that in galley again. But I had to lose 2 entire characters and 1 partial character from it, which I didn't like doing, because I really loved those characters. But we kill our babies, as they say, kill the things we love. And maybe that was the wise decision. People complained about the length more than anything else. But I wanted it to be historically accurate. I wanted to set it during the Red River Wars, which were at the time something that not a lot of people knew much about. I think it's been more celebrated in historical texts since then, and in the same part of the country. And in a sense, I kind of wanted it to be an indirect indicator of the founding of the town, which was because the main character is a girl named Aggie. And so the idea is that the town is named for her, though there's absolutely no basis in that, in fact, just strictly my imagination. And I have I probably wouldn't get it published today because of the varying points of view, and I'm not any of these things, never have been. So that might be an impediment in today's crowds reading establishment. But I think it's right. I think it's accurate to the period, and accurate to the characters.
You did extensive research, not just a little research.
About
Can
2
you go
years.
over
Yeah.
some of what you went through to write this book?
Yeah, I found out I didn't know anything about any of this. I grew up in this part of the country, but my community was a farming community, there were no cowboys in my school. Nobody wore boots and jeans. If they did, that had been made fun of. It was very much a farming community. And yet we were supposed to be a cowboy culture. And if you see go by the billboards on the highway, you'd think so. But none of that was really true. And so when I started writing it, I wrote about 150 pages, I guess, and realized I was guessing at way too much. I didn't know anything. And so I stopped writing entirely and went to doing research. And I was able to amass a pretty sizable library of Texana and Westernana at that time, uh, reading history, nonfiction accounts, as well as novels about the period, and trying to sift through what was accurate and what was not. And I mean, I did all kinds of field research. I didn't know what people ate in restaurants in 1876. I mean, when you sat down in a fancy hotel restaurant in Memphis, Tennessee, what did you order? What could you order? And so I went to Memphis and to the Peabody Hotel, and they let me into their archives and looked at menus from the period, which was very enlightening. I
That's
didn't know
pretty
a
cool.
lot of,
You see the
yeah.
ducks.
Yeah, oh yeah, saw the ducks.
All right.
Took my kids back to see the ducks many years later, but it was enlightening. I knew nothing about excuse me. I knew nothing about the fact that people didn't eat much beef. I thought everybody ate steak. If you watch John Wayne movies, you'd think so. And almost nobody ate beef because beef couldn't be preserved. Pork could be. So people ate pork, and they ate a lot of fowl because it could be fresh killed and served up. Fish, lots of fish, and lamb and that sort of thing were common fare. And even on I didn't know what buttons were made of. I didn't know when zippers were invented. I didn't know when anything about armament. I thought everybody carried a Colt Peacemaker until I found out differently, and had to do a lot of research on that. I didn't know how much a wagon could hold, or how big a wagon was, or I knew how to saddle a horse because I'd grown up doing that kind of thing, but
Yeah.
I didn't know how to do it with a 19th century tack, which is completely different from modern saddlery and tack. So all that
And
was,
you hang out with some reenactors.
I did. I went
And
to Fort
got some-
Concho and various places where they had living history museums. And these people are enthusiasts. They know it, and they live it, and I think in a way it's a little bit of a sickness.
Yeah, well,
Sort of like going, I suppose in science fiction, if you go to a Star Wars convention, you see,
yes,
so
but it's benign. It's like a benign brain tumor that gets hold of you.
right. But it's
From
very accurate. I mean, this guy put me through it. He had me loading black powder weapons and hitching up mule teams to wagons and doing all kinds of things, so I would know what it was like to do these things and how long it took to do them. And that was kind of because in my experience, people want to ride out after the bad guys from a town. They simply ran into the barn and 10 seconds later rode out on a fully saddled horse. I didn't realize it'd take a good 10, 15 minutes to, even for an expert, to saddle that horse. And if the horse was in there and available. So there was a lot to that I had to kind of figure out. I did a lot of Indian research, but I lost all of the Indian material out of the novel before it was published, and which greatly saddened me because I put a lot of time in on it. And a lot of terrain, a lot of stuff about the flora and fauna of the area. I knew what it looked like, but I didn't know what it was called a lot of the time, because it's just weeds to me. It didn't matter. And so I had to look up a lot of that. And I went out and stomped around on a lot of it. Sometimes that's very important for a writer to do. And so but I spent a little over 2 years doing that. And I got a research grant to do some of it for one summer. And I was able to sort of I didn't really take copious notes so much as just absorbed it and made notes on specifics. One of the things that was kind of curious, the plot centers on a transport of illegal whiskey to Santa Fe. That's the idea. That's the money. That's the money payoff on the whole thing. And so they're hauling whiskey on this wagon train, which is contraband. They weren't supposed to do that across areas that were in or near Indian reservations or anywhere near hostility, because it could be misused, of course. And I didn't know how much whiskey first of all, I didn't know how much they could put into a keg or into a barrel. I had a rough idea, but I had to look that up. That was hard to find. But what was harder to find was how much it was worth, the monetary value of even a bottle of whiskey in a saloon. And it varied widely from place to place. But I didn't know what a bottle of bonded Tennessee whiskey would cost in 1876. And that was something that I had to look up and find out so I could calculate the value of the cargo, how much a horse sold for. These sorts of things are the niggling details that wake you up at 3 a.m. and you go, is that, how much was a horse worth, in 1876? And that kind of thing was part of it. And I still have files full of notes on all of that, that I've been encouraged to write another historical. I wrote one other historical after this, but Tent Maker.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a lot of work. It's a huge amount of work.
Well, let's talk about Tent Maker briefly, because that is my favorite of your novels.
I think in some ways it's the best thing I've ever done.
It's a humorous novel, in a wry sort of Clay Reynolds kind of way.
Well, it is. It's supposed to be funny.
Yeah.
And it's supposed to be absurd in its own way. The idea for that novel came from a song, and I'm not sure who wrote it. I think James McMurtry wrote it. James McMurtry is Larry McMurtry's son, and he's something of a sensational recording artist, at least in Texas and Southwest. He's kind of a bluesy folksy guy. He doesn't really sing country, but so he doesn't really fit into any radio top 40 mold anywhere. I've been to a couple of his live concerts. He's very, very good. And I really like his music. I think I own about all of his albums. But he has this song called Level Land that he recorded. And I first started actually on a cover that Robert Earl Keen did, but I went back and found that he.
That's right. Because I was like, isn't that a Robert Earl Keen story?
Yeah.
Song?
Well, he did a cover of it.
It's a cover of the McMurtry song.
Yeah, no, either that or it's vice versa. I'm not really sure who wrote it. I've never looked it up to see who wrote it. But the opening line has to do with people who were on the Great Migration West, separated from the rest. They either the wagon lost a wheel, or they lacked ambition one. So they put down roots down in the earth, in the dirt, to keep them falling off the earth, and so forth. And they called it Level Land. But Level Land's an actual town, actually, way out in the Llano Estacado, flat plain,
yes,
of West Texas, where everything's flat as it can be. And I thought, that's a great idea for a story. And so I created a character whose wagon loses a wheel, and he doesn't have any ambition, and he's kind of just wandering. And I made him a tent maker, a guy who actually comes from a tent making family, a concern that makes actual tents. And he has a wagon load of canvas and muslin, and he's good with the needle. He can do it by hand, or so forth. And in those days, they didn't do machine made tents very much. Everything was done pretty much by hand, because sewing machine was a very new concept. And so it was invented, but it wasn't widely used. And so I kind of just started with that, and created this character that turned out to be a kind of hapless. I've used that word before with relation to breed love, but I'm using it here differently. Sort of a a drifting kind of person who just sort of lets life come to him, but he has principles, core principles that he can't quite violate. And the story needed was a woman, and I injected what I think is my best female character into this novel, Margot, who is a woman I fell instantly in love with, a character I could not stop loving. And she's an amalgamation of every woman I've ever known in my life who gave me trouble, and there are a lot of them, but all of their negative traits went into her in a way. She's beautiful and talented and smarter than he is, but at the same time knows what the realities of 19th century female rights and limitations are, and plays within that structure. So the tension between them forms the story of the novel, and then the founding of a town that he never meant to found. Another influence I had on this was a film by Sam Peckinpah called The Ballad of Cable Hogue, which I did not create a huge sensation. It's Jason Robards' vehicle, but I always loved. I thought it was a great idea, because the subtitle is "He Found Water Where It Wasn't," and created a town out in the middle of the Mojave Desert, and because he found found water, and water is what people needed on their journey west. So it's kind of a comedy, and has doesn't have a lot of substance to it, but it's at the same time I got that idea.
There are a couple of instances where, what's his name, Julian?
Hooley, yeah, Gil Hooley. Gilbert Hooley, yeah.
I mean, in the end, as hapless or as much as a reed as he might be in the wind, he's got this. There are certain moments when he becomes absolutely, heroic, or at least does what he thinks he has to do.
Well, he has, as I say, core value that he won't step beyond,
and there's some gunfight.
A sense of right and wrong, and even though it may risk more than he wants to risk, or take chances he doesn't want to take, I think he's like a lot of people in the real world who find themselves pushed up against a wall, and just they ultimately have to reach down in themselves and decide there's something bigger than I am, something more important than my comfort, safety, and I just have to take my stand here. And that's kind of what I wanted for him, was that value to come through. And I think it's something that ultimately Margot comes to realize and reckon with. There's a wonderful scene in the book that I think is the best thing I've ever written, and I've sometimes read it, although I don't think my audiences really get it out of context, which is it's a Christmas scene where this little community that's formed around him are in this sort of makeshift store that's been created by a drifting cowboy and his prostitute lover, and they've had a child, and the child is newborn, and they are all in the store around a stove, and it's warm, and it's the community, everybody's there, and they're having some sort of beverage and food, and it's a very familial atmosphere sort of thing. And I think that captures something of the warmth and the genuineness of the American experience in a sort of Stephen Foster nostalgic way that I really wanted to communicate, because I think that's what people really seek, even though they don't often always find it, is that sense of community, of belonging, comfort. And even though the outside world may be hostile, and in this case, it's snowing and blowing wind and snow outside, it's not pleasant. So it's hostile outside, but inside it's warm and it's genuine, and there's this great feeling of love and affection that is not in any way tainted by the sins of the people who were actually there. So that's I like that piece. I really like that piece. Yeah. And a writer shouldn't talk about stuff he likes, I guess.
Oh, well.
Once in a while. And when I wrote it, I didn't feel that way about it. When I wrote it, I will admit, I was misty-eyed when I finished it, and I didn't go back and touch it. Yeah. Left it go.
Were you using a lot of the same historical information that you had acquired from writing Franklin's Crossing when you wrote
Oh, yeah.
Maker?
Oh yeah, I had lots of details that was able to use, particularly with regard to women in the West, prostitution, the creation of tent cities, tent towns, which were very common, and dugouts and that sort of thing. The plainsman character, but is certainly drawn from that. But also the Texas Rangers, which were just a little, not even a half step, quarter step off of being absolute outlaws themselves, and were terribly feared. And then the regulators were greatly feared. And I got a lot of flack for that because of the violence in the book. It is a terribly violent book in places. And I probably made a mistake in starting off with a violent scene. I think that put a lot of readers off. But I had one contest I would have won had one judge not refused to read the book after the first chapter. But there you go. When you got 3 judges and one won't read it, that pretty much takes you out of the running.
Well, you might have drawn in some readers.
Yeah, I might have.
Had
they got to the second chapter, she would have been fine.
Yeah.
But these people were horrible people, and a lot of them were just, as they're described, alley trash, more proud of the dirt they wear than they are of the dirt they are. And they are they're not many of them are psychopathic, and many of them were seriously deranged. But the Texas Rangers are just a half shade off of them. They're pretty much murderers themselves. And so that element of it was something I wanted to keep in there. Yeah. But I also give them a kind of comic aspect too. I don't want them all to be evil. And in fact, the absurdity of it is part of the novel's thing, that life is absurd. I mean, no one could write reality. I just was talking to a former student about this a week or so ago. I said, she asked me about the difference between reality and credibility. And I said, well, you couldn't write reality. If you wrote reality, nobody would believe it. If you wrote about what happened on January 6th and December 6th, nobody would have believed it. Everybody said this is pure conjecture, fantasy, action. It's going to be an action film, maybe. Put Dennis Quaid in the main role, and you're good to go. But it happened, and 9/11, same thing. I said the same thing about that. And she wrote about a bunch of Arabic yahoos who hijacked 3 airliners and crashed 2 of them into World Trade Center. Nobody believed that in 1995. Try selling that book, and yet, it happened.
Yeah.
So these are the sorts of things that you can't. Reality is often unpredictable and much stranger than fiction, as the saying goes. But I'm trying to create a reality in the fiction that is credible, and because of its absurdity. I mean, Quanah, where I grew up, Tony, was supposed to be was selected as the city where Texas Tech University would be founded. And the city fathers voted against it. They said
ruin the town.
Yeah, they didn't want a bunch of outsiders coming in here, and they'd had to vote a water bill to increase the availability of water. And it was going to cost a lot of money, and they weren't sure this would ever pay off. And why would they want this here? So it went to Lubbock instead. So, Lubbock's now a metropolis, and Quanah's drying up and dying.
Yeah, I believe Birmingham, Alabama said something about about developing an international airport, and said, leave it to Atlanta.
Yeah, who wants it?
We got the steel mills.
Yeah, well, it's happened.
My home
before.
region.
Yeah, the city fathers in Beaumont, where I lived for 10 years, they turned down opportunities to deepen the port, dredge the port, make it a deep water port, and they turned it down. They didn't want all these sailors coming in there and this negative element corrupting the town and that sort of thing. So sure.
Well, they certainly installed a hurricane magnet, that's for sure.
That's for sure. And this pollution and mosquitoes, and it's what they're known for.
So you wrote some other novels. These are contemporary novels. Players is your crime novel you're referring to.
Right.
Monuments revisits Agatite, and it's less of a desperate novel and more of a I don't know what you call it. It's a reverie on youth, but at the same time, that sort of social commentary on a small town.
Yeah, yeah, that's fair.
And you have the ghost of James Dean racing people in Texas in Threading the Needle.
Yeah, I wanted to write a book for each of my children, and Monuments was for my son, and Threading the Needle for my daughter. Though she never drove cars like that. But the idea was the relationship between fathers and sons, fathers and daughters, I think was what I was trying to get to in both of those. I'm not sure how successfully. Monuments, I think, is a pretty good novel. I like it a lot because it's sentimental. It also brought into a play a character that I'd been wanting to write about that was based on a character from my hometown, a guy from my hometown, who we called, and this is a terrible thing to say, but everybody called him Dummy Wilson. And he was called Dummy Wilson because he was mute and mostly deaf, and I don't have any idea why. He was an older man, probably in his 50s by the time I was old enough to be aware of his existence. We were all terrified of him because he would come around and he loved children. He doted on. He probably was retarded as well as having these disabilities. But he would come around and offer us popsicle or lollipops or something, and we would run from him. And the older kids would throw rocks at him and one thing another, really cruel. Two of the churches employed him as a part-time janitor, and he swept out the barbershops for money, swept off the sidewalks for money, and was always in overalls and kind of a tramp-looking guy. But I don't have any idea what happened to him. But he was sort of a feature of the small town character, as it were. And everybody liked him. I mean, nobody disliked him, tolerated him, I guess would be a better word, and was friendly enough to him, the adults were, and protective of him to some extent. And I thought, being the town pariah has certain advantages and disadvantages. So I wanted to create a pariah character, which I did in the book, and giving him a relationship with this young boy, this teenage boy, um, who has a strained relationship with his own father, who's very weak, and his mother, who is very strong, but at the same time perverse in her own way. Uh, was sort of my way of uh, recapturing that time and that kind of milieu.
Yeah. He's kind of a wise hermit in your book, or
yeah,
and he lives in a boxcar, right, or something.
Right, right. And a lot of people did. I mean, people would put these boxcars out on a piece of land and make homes out of them, these old boxcars. And so it made sense to me. I mean, I've seen people from a distance living in these, and often they had large gardens and made a regular home of it. Some of them even ran livestock in the back. A boxcar could be a very solid piece of domicile if you don't mind the shape of it. And it had nothing, these weren't cattle cars. These were just regular freight box cars that had been retired by the railroad and were often offered for sale. I knew one guy lived in a caboose that he bought and set up on a piece of property in town and lived in it for a number of years till it burned down. And so that sort of happened. Mm-hmm. And Threading the Needle, I don't know where that came from. I always kind of wanted to dabble in horror fiction, and this was sort of my essay into that. I'm not sure how successfully, but I had a '67 Mustang when I was young, and I always kind of abused it because Mustangs were as common as spit. The only thing more common was a BW Bug. Everybody had them, so it was no big deal. But
my parents did.
Yeah, and looking back on it, I'm going, I saw one for sale just like it on this online site for cars, and I think it was $27,000 for this same exact car that I tore completely up and ran 150,000 miles on and blew the engine out of before it finally fell apart. And that was nothing. I didn't feel like I'd wasted a big deal. It was just a car. But their attitudes change. But I wanted to write that one because of the sentimental relationship also between the girl and her deceased brother. which I think sometimes those sibling relationships can be extremely powerful. And I wanted to kind of capture that too. And I wanted to see how I could do it writing suspense fiction, which is not something I had ever tried to do deliberately before, to create to build toward a suspense climax. And I think it probably came off just as well as it could be expected. So
Clay, what are you working on now? You are retired from I mean, you spent years running that creative writing program at UTD.
I did, yeah.
Um,
And it impaired my writing. You taught there, you know what it does to you. It makes it difficult.
if you care
Particularly
about your students, it becomes very difficult to get your own work done sometimes.
it sure does. And then you add in caring about your family on top of that, plus, just growing older, which saps your energy. Pretty soon you keep saying, I'm going to get started on something as a matter of, brushing your teeth. I have a couple of projects that are half started, well started, I should say, well begun, and I have put aside for the time being. One is both are nonfiction, which may or may not be a good thing. One is a memoir of 1968. I spent 1968 portion of it, the summer of it, in Houston, driving, as I mentioned earlier, a bottle truck for a 7-Up company, and going broke, chasing a girl that I never caught.
Well, you
And
should have maybe driven a car instead of a 7-Up truck to
yeah,
chase
maybe I should
after
have.
her.
I drove that car down there. I'll tell you, that was but no, it was an adventure. I was 18 in Houston, on my own completely. I try to imagine that of a 18-year-old today. My parents were very much opposed to my doing it, and they didn't support me for it. They did bring me home finally when I went broke. But renting an apartment and setting it up and going through all of the um, uh, the mechanics of doing that now seem when I look at some of the freshmen I've taught over the years, I'm thinking I couldn't imagine these kids doing that, but I did it, and I got this job driving I've tried 2 or 3 jobs before I landed on 7-Up. I sold encyclopedia and worked in a fishing lure factory for a short time, but then I went to 7-Up, and that was an adventure too. That was 68 was a seminal year, important year. So much happened there. It's a watershed year, I guess is the best way of putting it. I think there are always a few years are like that. 1876 is like that. I think maybe 1918 is like that. There's just a few years in which so much happens. And in that particular context, we have Martin Luther King assassinated, Bobby Kennedy assassinated. You have the Democratic National Convention after the Republican National Convention in Miami. You've got these city riots that are going on and around the country. Vietnam has heated up. LBJ decides not to run again. The Tet Offensive occurred earlier in the year. And so you got all this stuff happening in 1968, just swirling around you. And yet what I remember most about it is the rock and roll. I remember the music and the experience of living in Houston in the Montrose area, which now is, I think, a very what they call a hipster area in Houston, very upscale history. But then was old and kind of decrepit and falling apart and in decline, and was the scene of a lot of beatnik activity. And I got involved in some coffee shop groups and people like that while I was there. So I had quite an adventure that summer, and it was a coming of age sort of thing. So I'm working on that, and I like it, but it's not politically correct, and I'm not sure how it'll be received. And in that same vein, I'm working on another longer piece, or long piece about racism, and it's not what a lot of people might think. I'm trying to, in a way, kind of do an analysis of what it means to be a white person of privilege, a privileged white person in today's America, and to respond to what's going on culturally and sociologically, as well as racially in the country, and to try to put that into a context that I think makes sense. It's not a confession or anything of that nature, but it's also not a condemnation. And it's an acknowledgement of generational coming of age again, of a sort of sense of awareness that awakens over time of the realities of the society in which we live. It's not political. It's not meant to be political. It doesn't take a stance one way or another. It's simply a kind of analysis and memoir. Again, it's based in memoir of what it's like to grow up in a world that starts in the depths of the Jim Crow era, when no one thought about these things or even talked about these things, and suddenly to find myself now at the other end of my life, when it's so when one becomes so aware of it that you can't escape it. You can't escape being told about it. It's
Mm,
everywhere we turn.
yeah.
And how to react to that as a person uh, who is in society and who is politically astute, I think I am, and aware, but without being an activist of any sort or trying to take any kind of stance on it, and to be both fair-minded and at the same time real about it. Sifting through the bullshit is sometimes harder than it looks, and getting past the noise into the meaning behind the noise is kind of what this is an attempt to do. I don't know if that will ever go anywhere,
Mm.
or I'll ever do anything with it, but it's good. It's good writing for me, good writing exercise for me.
Well, it sounds like a characterization of all your fiction, actually, that last sentence you said.
Yeah, well, that may be true.
So, I mean, there's always a nuance and a beauty to your work, and things are not cut and dried in Clay Reynolds novel, but neither are they uninteresting. There's always a complexity and interest to what you do, and a lot of it's about Texas.
It is. I write, when I started out, I say I did not want to be identified as a Texas writer or a regional writer at all. In fact, I rejected that whole idea when Dick Merrick, or his publicist at Dutton, at St. Martin's, advanced it. And I had a big falling out with his successor there over at Michael Segalian, and I fell out over it, arguing about it. But I was stupid about that at the time, because I finally awakened to the fact that the sesquicentennial was going on in the state, and that Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings and that whole music thing was going on, and film was going on about Texas and Westerns, and it was hot. I mean, people started wearing denim everywhere, and you could see cowboy boots in Manhattan. And I mean, I can remember when Kinky Friedman's place in Manhattan was the only place you could buy chicken fried steak east of the Mississippi. And when Johnny Carson couldn't pronounce jalapeno when he was introducing the bean dip commercial on his show. I mean, this goes back to a time of transition, and there was a certain opportunity there that I finally decided I better latch onto. And I don't really apologize for that. I know McMurtry had his T-shirt that said minor regional novelist, that he wore around for a while after Horseman Passed By was published, I think. Um, I didn't feel that way, but at the same time, I didn't like the branding, the identity. But I finally decided it was better to embrace it than it was to reject it. And maybe it wasn't going to hurt me any. Maybe now it does. I don't know, particularly given the political circumstances of the last several years.
Well, I don't
Uh,
know, but the way that people get into, I mean, the way that things are advertised can interest people, and then when they start reading it, they realize that they've got something unique and cool in the same way that any art that you come across can be a
right.
genre, but if you're good at it, it's not going to be a disappointment. And I think that these are great books, and
Thanks. Thank you.
and we have them for sale at Baen.com and across all the platforms we distribute. Just for me, and because I'm a science fiction guy, and there are a lot of affinities between historical fiction and science fiction. Mm-hmm. I would say a good place for a lot of our listeners and viewers to get into this is to go to the historicals, The Tent Maker and Franklin's Crossing, and then try the if you like ghost stories, try that crazy drag racing rock and roll one, and if you like quiet reflections on small towns that are dying around you, even as you as you are the sheriff of it, go read The Vigil, which is I'm mischaracterizing it. It's a beautiful reflection on
well, The Vigil, I think The Vigil,
strange and sort of doomed relationship. So
The Vigil has a haunting quality, I'm told, particularly by filmmakers who optioned it but never made it. They find it intriguing, and
it would be a challenge.
Yeah, well, I think it would be. Although I've come close, I have twice or three times come to contract on it, but then there's always a glitch, and the film never got made. Films never got made, but it would be nice. I mean, it would be a way of getting the book out. I really don't care about the movie. I like to have the money from the movie. I would really more interested in what it would do for the book, because it's the books that matter to me. And the thing about, and I don't want to prolong this. I know you're on a time thing here, but there's a sense that you reach a certain point where you feel like you said what you have to say. And I don't want to be one of those old duffers. I'm reading a book right now, I won't name the writer, who's in his late 80s and still grinding them out. And they're just getting worse and worse. And I think it's a bad legacy to leave, where essentially he's become kind of a parody of himself.
Yeah, I think I know who you're talking about.
You might.
He's right about New Orleans a lot.
No, different guy. Different
but
guy, but yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, but it just sort of made me sad to read it and think of the power behind his earlier work and how significant it was, that he feels this need to continue to get something in between two covers. And he's going with very small presses, smaller and smaller all the time. And his work's just getting weaker and weaker. And I'm thinking it's almost an embarrassment. It's sort of like trying to see some old duffer out, still trying to be a NFL quarterback, or still trying to play with the NBA or something, when they really are past it. They've lost whatever they have, and they were 25, and now they're in their 40s. It's time to, or coming up on 40. It's time to hang it up. You just have to know when to. McMurtry has a wonderful essay about that in his book "In a Narrow Grave," called "A Valediction," and which take my saddle from the wall kind of thing. And this idea of there comes a time when it's best to just call a halt to it and say, I'm done. I've said what I have to say. I'm not sure I'm at that point yet, and I may get a stimulation and start working on something tomorrow or tonight. That could happen, because you don't know when it's coming from. But I don't write deliberately. I don't sit down and try to think up something to write. I want it to come to me, and if it comes to me and I can't get rid of it, that's the best thing that can happen.
Well, that's a good place to leave it, I think. But I do not think you're done, and I hope that you aren't. And but we got a long body of work that you've left behind, a trail that the readers can follow on if they want to.
Well, I would love for that to happen, and I would love to hear from them if they like it, or if for that matter, if they don't. I don't care. I can ignore the nasty stuff. A sale is a sale,
That's right. That's the way we look at it too.
Sure.
Oh. Well, Clay Reynolds, thank you so much for talking with us today.
Thank you, Tony. I appreciate it so very much. Thank you.
Here is another entry in David Weber's Honor Harrington series masterpiece, Uncompromising Honor. Honor keeps her promise. The Solarian League. For hundreds of years they have borne the banner of human civilization, But the bureaucratic mandarins who rule today's league are corrupt and looking for scapegoats. They've decided the upstart Star Kingdom of Manticore must be annihilated. Uncompromising courage. Honor Harrington has worn the Star Kingdom's uniform for half a century. Very few know war the way Honor Harrington does. So far, hers has been a voice of caution. But now the Mandarins have committed atrocities such as the galaxy has not known in 1,000 years. They have finally killed too many of the people Honor Harrington loves. Uncompromising vengeance. Now Honor Harrington is coming for the Solarian League, and hell is riding in her wake. And now, David Weber's Uncompromising Honor.
CNO's office, Admiralty Building. City of Old Chicago, Old Earth, Sol System. The comm pinged. Winston Kingsford snarled at the sound. He'd left strict orders that he wasn't to be disturbed by anybody short of Innocenti Kolokoltsov himself while he tried to make sense out of the confused reports from TF-790 survivors. And since he'd just finished speaking to Kolokoltsov 20 minutes ago, and since if anyone in the entire Sol system understood why he needed to be left alone to get on with it, that someone had to be Kolokoltsov, he rather doubted this was the permanent senior undersecretary for foreign affairs, which meant whoever was pinging his comm was about to acquire a new anal orifice. It pinged again, and he stabbed the acceptance key angrily. "What?" he snapped. "Excuse me, Admiral," Chief Petty Officer Chernova said. She'd been Kingsford's personal yeoman for well over 10 years, and she sounded remarkably calm in the face of his obvious displeasure. "I said no interruptions, Morellis," he pointed out ominously. "Yes, Admiral, I know, but Brigadier Geddes insists on speaking to you." "Gaddis?" Kingsford blinked. "You mean Simeon Gaddis, the gendarme?" "Yes, sir. He says it's urgent, a matter of life and death." Kingsford started to refuse. He couldn't imagine anything that might be life and death to the gendarmerie that didn't come a piss-poor second to keeping his navy alive. On the other hand, Gaddis wasn't stupid. In fact, aside from a certain quixotic streak where things like corruption were concerned, he had a reputation as one of the smartest people on the block. He was also one of the people who was most likely to have heard the truth about Operation Fabius, not the garbled accounts of victory which had leaked to the boards. That meant he had to know Kingsford was going to be less than responsive to anything else for a while, from which it followed, "Well, in that case, I guess you'd better put him through, Morellis," he sighed. "He's not on the comm, sir," Chernova replied. "He's here, in person." Kingsford's eyebrows tried to climb into his hairline, then he shrugged. "In that case, change that to, I guess you'd better send him in," he said, and stood behind his desk as Chief Chernova showed the gendarmerie officer into his office. Under the circumstances, he decided to dispense with the customary offer of refreshments and twitched his head at the office door. Chernova smiled faintly and effaced herself without another word. "With all due respect, Brigadier Gaddis," Kingsford said then, waving brusquely for Gaddis to take a seat, "this really had better be damned important. I know the boards are starting to talk about our great victory, but to paraphrase King Pyrrhus, another victory or two like this one and we're all fucked." He showed his teeth in something that wasn't a smile. "So, I'm just a little busy right now." "Understood, Admiral." Gaddis nodded. "In fact, that's why I'm here. There are a few things you need to know."
That was another entry in the complete audiobook serialization of Uncompromising Honor by David Weber. And that's it for the podcast, thanks to Audible.com and to podcast theme composer Ruth Judkowitz. And a hearty hi-ho silver and a who ya callin' Tonto Kimosabi, along with thanks and praise to Clay Reynolds, Western writer extraordinaire and author of Franklin's Crossing, The Tent Maker, and other novels. Please join us next time here at the hammering heart of science fiction and fantasy, and keep reaching for the stars.